Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Wednesday, February 5th, 2025, and today we're talking about, does wool make a good mulch, and why do we have so much wool that we can make mulch out of it? Which cells or soil blocks to use for which crops, and kickstarting that spring compost pile. So let's do it. All right, so welcome to Wednesday, friends. I am very tired after a pretty good night of working with my fellow board members at the local soccer league, getting the teams all put together. That is such a wild job, just in general. The logistics involved are unreal with parental requests and finding coaches and all that stuff. Can't wait for the season, though. Make sure to thank your local soccer organizations or sports organizations. Doesn't have to be soccer. Should be soccer. Doesn't have to be. Can't wait for the season, though. All this nice weather has me itching for soccer season. Amusingly, yesterday I talked about the importance of slowing down to speed up and mentioned how detail-oriented this show is. There's a ton of details that go into making it happen. And I had forgotten to hit publish on the episode from Monday for you podcast-only crowd. So if you're listening to this, sorry y'all. But hopefully once we get an editor/producer, there will be fewer of those. 2 for Tuesdays. Anyway, this week I've been working on some more starts, some plant starts, getting the season rolling. I started some kale, got some celery going. I'm trying 4 different varieties this season for some ambitious reason. I got the peppers started again, obviously if you heard yesterday's show at least, and a couple more trays of onions. I've not started the same onions 1 month apart like this before. Candy is the variety. I started again this week. So that should be a fun accidental comparison. I just felt like there are 2 trays that the germination is a little low in, and I want to make sure to maximize my onion efforts this year for the space I've given them. The more onions, the merrier for us in general. So yeah, that should be good and tasty. Love those candy onions. Next week, I'll be jumping on our ginger, which takes the better part of a lifetime to germinate, so we'll talk about that soon. And our tomatoes will get their start as well next week. I don't do really any eggplant anymore, only because we never really had a great market for it. I usually just buy some from a friend at some point in the season because eggplant is delicious, but it is a little bit hard for us to sell. When we ran a CSA, though, that was a great crop to have in there. It's a good filler, but also I think having it once or twice or 3 times through a season, I think people are into that. Anyway, if I did start eggplant, I would be starting them next week as well. One thing I don't think I've really talked about much, kind of in this vein, which will be especially important for newer growers, is fitting the size of the cell or the soil block that you're using to the crop that you want to grow. What I mean is that although sure, pretty much every vegetable crop can be started in a 128 cell tray, not every crop should be started in a 128 cell tray, or at least that's not how we do it or have done it, because we'd prefer to not have to fertilize a transplant for any substantial amount of time. Also, it could be said that every crop could be started in 72 cell trays or 2-inch soil blocks, which would be awesome, frankly. Those lettuce crops would absolutely jam. But in doing so, you'd be using a lot of expensive soil mix and space in the greenhouse, so you have to strike a balance for what size cell tray you use for which crops. Now, I'm going to give you some specific crops and what size cells/blocks I start them in, but I don't have a monopoly on all the good advice or good experience, so commenters feel free to jump in. Let's start with the tiniest, the 200 cell trays or the 200 soil block maker from Swift Blocker. I'll just say from the outset, I don't use the 200 cell trays because the cells are just so tiny, but I do use the 200 block soil block trays because they have more volume of soil mix so they can sustain plants for longer. We use the 200 blocks primarily for lettuce, although we will also employ them for beets, spinach, cilantro, and dill as well. These are crops that are in the blocks only for a short time, for like a few weeks tops. So the lack of mix there is not as damaging. The one exception is onions, which are not super hungry and usually survive fine in the 200 soil block tray. Though if I was using cells, I would go with 128s for onions. Then for the next level, which would be the 128 cells or block makers for us, the 35 block standing blocker is the kind of the next step up, the closest thing to a 128 that we have. This size cell or block is reserved for crops that will be in slightly longer in the greenhouse. So kale, that is a crop I want to grow out kind of just past its first true leaves, kind of to the point when it's like 3 inches tall or so before I put it in the field. Celery too, which takes what feels like years to germinate and grow, could do better in the next size up, especially if you're using cells, but works pretty well in 1/28, or at least in that 35 block standing block maker. Fennel is kind of the same boat. It's not quite as slow as celery, obviously, but it's still pretty slow. It's like a 70, 80 day crop. And I usually like to grow that to a pretty decent size before transplanting. But like the celery, I also don't want to transplant it too early. If I transplant it too early and we get a cold snap, the celery, things like celery and fennel can bolt pretty easily. So I try and keep them in the greenhouse as long as I can. And then once they get in the field, if there's any chance of frost, I make sure to cover them. So the goal is generally to give each crop enough volume of soil mix to survive for long enough to closer to 6 or even 8 weeks before transplanting. I also use this sort of like 1/28 size for radicchio, basil, and Napa cabbage, zinnias and cosmos, among others. Generally speaking, for heavier feeders, I like the next size up, which is what we call 72s, which could be cells or blocks, or the 2-inch soil block maker made with the 4-block hand blocker. Just when you say that enough times, it just sounds like complete nonsense, but hopefully you're following. Basically, if it's a super hungry crop like broccoli, cauliflowers, tomatoes, peppers, Brussels sprouts, that sort of stuff, it goes into a 72 cell size soil block or cell. Anything that is going to be a little slow to germinate but very hungry once it gets going is a 72 cell or larger block crop for me. Cucurbits like winter squash, cucumbers, etc. If I'm using a tray at all, which I do usually use a tray instead of directly seeding them. I use wind strips to keep the roots from touching. That's my preference. If you use soil blocks for cucurbits, you just have to separate the blocks on the tray so that the roots don't mingle. Cucurbits have super sensitive roots. Don't mess around with those. Like, make sure that you're not messing with them too much when you're transplanting, but also when you're just moving them around. Anyway, that's kind of the bulk of the crops that we grow from seed. And like I said, you could just move everything up to bigger cells and treat it like part of your fertility program, but you just need the room to manage that number of trays. Hopefully that can come in handy for some of you as we head into the transplant starting season, for most of us, at least here in the US. Let me know your thoughts or how your approach differs. Anyway, we'll take a quick break and then we'll talk about wool as a mulch, and also why can we talk about wool as a mulch? BRB. Today's episode of Growers Daily is brought to you by Farmhand. I don't know about you, but I got into farming to be in the field growing food for my community, not creating elaborate pack lists, not writing newsletters or responding to emails, not designing and maintaining web stores, and etc. And I especially don't enjoy doing those things after an already full and fulfilling day of growing food. Actually, if I spent less time on my phone and behind the computer, that would be great. If only there were a solution for that. Enter Farmhand. Farmhand is the only all-in-one virtual assistant built by and for farmers. With one single platform, Farmhand enables you to offload your administrative tasks, send and manage communications, and sell more to your customers. Farmhand saves growers an average of 6 hours of administrative load each week. That's 6 hours so you can get back into the field, spend more time with friends or family, or have a life outside of the farm, which is actually a thing. Think about it. What would you do with an extra 6 hours a week? Sign up for a free trial with the link in the show notes, because now is the best time to dial in those systems for the next growing season. Follow the Farmhand link in the show notes to learn more. All right, back to the show. If you, the listener, are enjoying this content, getting even a small amount of value from it, consider supporting our work over at patreon.com/no-till-growers. I will try to get to questions from everywhere that questions come in, but I will always get to your Patreon questions. Now, today's Patreon question comes from Patreon member Kaylee Swisher, who writes, quote, "Hello, Jesse. First, I have to say thank you for all the videos you post and for everything you've taught my family. Every time we get in the car now, I have 4 mini farmers chanting Farmer Jesse in the back seat until I turn on your podcast for the drive. My 7-year-old Icarus would probably listen to your podcast all day long if I let him, and has some big plans for growing carrots this year. It's amazing getting to watch the next generation of earth tenders take shape. So thank you again." End quote for a second. That's super awesome. And thank you, mini farmers. And hi, Icarus. Good luck on your carrots. All right, Kaylee continues, quote, "Now, for my question, I was wondering if you have any knowledge on the use of sheep's wool for garden paths / a base mulch layer. We live in sheep country, upstate New York, and have easy access to mulch quality wool. I experimented last year and used it in my garden along my paths, and it seemed to work great as a weed barrier and also seemed to keep the hordes of slugs away from my crops compared to other places I didn't use it. Overall, I was happy with the results, and it made for great barefoot gardening. I got the idea from local farmers who use scrap wool to fill in muddy spots of their property, like around gates, with great success. It tends to cut down on the mud and standing water, but I also found in my garden that it kept the soil moist enough to keep the garden from drying out quickly. Supposedly, it breaks down quickly in a year or two, but we haven't been given a long enough break from the snow to really check it out on our own property yet. I was just curious if you knew of any actual research on its continued use or your thoughts on it. My personal experience has been overwhelmingly positive thus far, but I'd love to hear another opinion just to make sure I'm not overlooking something that might create long-term negative results. Thanks again for your time and hope to hear your thoughts on the matter. End quote. All right, awesome. So thanks, Kaylee. Great question. I too am fascinated by the idea of using wool as a mulch. I hadn't looked that much into the research really since writing my book back in 19 or 20. So here's a little what I could find. First, wool on the surface, not a pun I intended, but wool generally does make for an effective mulch. It holds water well, it slowly releases nutrients such as nitrogen, potassium, sodium, iron, and phosphorus, along with some micronutrients. It keeps the soil in place, it blocks the weeds. In effect, it works as any good mulch should. I don't foresee it breaking down after a single season in your conditions, however, though maybe that is true for those who bury it in holes, as you mentioned. That said, some amount of supplementing or refreshing after the first season might be in order depending on how much soil fell on top of the wool, how thick it was. All that stuff could eventually provide the right situation for weeds to germinate. I cannot find any science to back up the slug thing really, but it seems anecdotally many people observe what you did. However, it may also be that the effect is as simple as the wool not encouraging slugs rather than the wool discouraging them. Again, it's not very well studied as far as I can tell. Now, I found myself, and you will have to forgive me for this, equally interested in why there was so much wool going to waste enough to even think about mulching with it. For those who have not ever raised sheep, if you have wool sheep, as opposed to what we call hair sheep or the less beat around the bushy meat sheep, you have to shear the wool breeds regularly or the wool can become a nightmare for the sheep. That is to say hot, but also prone to diseases like fly strike and pests like parasites, as well as losing their ability to effectively run away from predators. But it's no small job to shear them. Now, there has always been some wool waste from poor quality, or the sheep get into a bunch of cockleburs or whatever, and the wool becomes less usable. However, the big current problem is we are just absolutely in the age of fast fashion, and the wool market is not exactly booming. The textile industry has moved more in the direction of synthetics, and as a result, the infrastructure to process wool is slowly dying out. Therefore, a lot of wool produced goes to waste, and farmers find that it's cheaper to just compost it rather than send it to the nearest processor. Certainly, some have found a niche within the small makers and spinners world. Others are trying to tap into its fertilization potential, but that's just not maybe a big enough market to sustain many large wool farms. So in places with historically large amount of wool producers, finding cheap or even free wool may indeed be an opportunity for small-scale gardeners. Of course, at some point, people will simply stop bothering with producing wool sheep, so it's hard to say how long that option will be around. But as for a garden mulch, the promise is definitely there, and of course, perhaps one day we will stop relying so heavily on fast fashion items in favor of truly regenerative products, such as wool that is literally grown by sheep from grass that they eat that is grown by the sun. So it's basically like we're wearing sunshine. Yeah. But I don't expect that to happen anytime soon. Or perhaps wool will find a second life, such as in agriculture, because it can make not just a good mulch, but a good fertilizer. I won't hold my breath, though, as processing is not simple or cheap. One thing we would like to do here at No-Till Growers eventually is to have a farm-to-noggin, no-till growers hats like this, but maybe like a beanie or something. So maybe if you're in the textile farming world and doing some cool ecological stuff involving rotational grazing of sheep or no-till fiber hemp or cotton or something, and at least preferably have identified some sort of pathway to turn that into a hat, holler at us at no-tillgrowers@gmail.com with the subject line hats. Would be cool to use this platform to support some cool farmers doing cool things with textiles. So maybe there's a collaboration awaiting. Anyway, I hope that's helpful. It certainly has been an interesting journey for me to kind of review some of this stuff on wool. Thanks for the question. And when we come back, we will talk about kickstarting that ornery compost pile. Be right back. Today's episode of Growers Daily is brought to you by groSMART. Curious if your soil will be ready for planting this spring? groSMART can help you find out with their at-home soil tests. They'll ship it right to your door. Just send it back with your prepaid shipping and you'll have your lab results in just 2 business days. Their reports are simple with tailored seasonal recommendations for fertilizers and amendments. Order now at groSMART.com and use the code DAILY for 10% off. That's DAILY. Begin your soil prep now for a great spring with groSMART. All right, back to the show. All right, so let's talk about some tips and tricks for kickstarting that spring compost pile. What often happens for us is that in the spring, we have a nice pile of compost that has sat there from the fall and grown over the winter from food scraps, leaves, crops, residue, rotten potatoes or squashes or whatever we've added to it. But sometimes things are just not popping off like you want them to, and the compost pile is stubbornly sitting there staring at you mockingly. Or that's what it feels like. So here are some ideas and tips for getting that thing going. First, the right amount of moisture is key. If it's too wet, it won't go. If it's too dry, it won't go. So if wetness is the problem, some dry carbonaceous materials will help. Leaves, maybe wood chips, something not too fine like sawdust, but also not too big like sticks. If all you have is sawdust, just mix it in sparingly and mix it in slowly until the consistency of the compost materials is where you can kind of squeeze a little water out of it, but it's not just like mushing out of your hands. It should smell fresh, not like anaerobic, which if you don't know what anaerobes smell like, think manure. Alternatively, you can use a blower or pipes to help get air into the pile, though that can mean finding perforated pipe and repiling the pile, which is probably more work than necessary. Instead, use a good light, mixing with a pitchfork. That will help inject a little oxygen and nudge the composting process along. If the pile is too dry, I like adding a good compost tea or extract to get those microbes and moisture in there simultaneously. Just mix it in slowly until you hit that same nice moisture level. Now, give that a day or two and see if it heats up. If not, you may need to add some fresh nitrogen. This can be tough in the winter before there is anything green to add. So you may have to get creative and find something at the store, like a small bag of organic alfalfa pellets. You can soak those in a small amount of water and pour that into the center of the pile, then just cover it up. Preferably whatever you use is not chlorinated. If that is all the water that you have access to, like county water, consider leaving a bucket of it out overnight to help kind of off-gas some of that stuff. You can also add a little humic acid if you have it. That'll help neutralize some of those chemicals. Also, I recommend throwing a tarp or something over top to preserve the moisture and help distribute it. It does not have to be a tarp, though. I mean, heck, it could be a cap of leaves or wool. Yeah, more uses for it. Whatever makes sense for you and your pile and your context. They make special compost coverings that retain moisture, but also allow it to come in from rain. So if you're doing this on scale, one of those may be worth the investment. I do like that funky mix of compost tea, though, as an inoculant and just to get the party rolling, even if just a little bit of that. More often than not, though, as long as the moisture is relatively correct, a little forking will do the trick. Now, there is the chance that none of these small fixes work, and the problem might just be that the pile was already decomposed to a point that it's not going to heat back up. In this case, you will basically have to build another pile and involve the decomposed material both lightly mixed in, but also just as a cap. That is to say, lightly piled over the top. Then you would definitely want to put a tarp over top to help trap the heat and kill any weed seeds that's in that compost. To be sure, material that just slowly broke down or heated up and broke down while you weren't looking can be solid compost, but the weed seed is where you may run into issues and potentially plant pathogens. So ideally, it goes through a monitored composting process, which indeed, compost won't do that twice. Like once it's been composted, it's not going to heat back up. Anyway, I hope that's helpful. Let me know what fun tricks you all use to jumpstart your compost piles. I'm going to wrap it up there, but before we go, I want to give one last shout out to the good folks over at Rimmel Greenhouses. Let's see if I can do this live read. Getting better at it, I think. Whether you're growing tomatoes for market, flowers in the spring, or vegetables for your family, growing in a high tunnel protected from the weather provides the right environment for a harvest you can count on. Rimmel greenhouses are strong, durable, and easy to assemble, offering the quality you need to grow productively year-round. The team of experts at Rimmel Greenhouse Systems will be your trusted partners to ensure you get exceptional value from your greenhouse or high tunnel investment. Visit Rimmel.com today to get growing. Huge thank you to all of our show sponsors. Huge shouts to Willie Breeding for the theme music and the team at No-Till Growers. Also, shouts to Epidemic Sound for the background music you were hearing. Pick up a copy of the Living Soil Handbook or the Seed Farmer at no-tillgrowers.com to support our work. Big thank you to everyone over at patreon.com/no-tillgrowers, where at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, or you sign up for the month of February, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs today to our weeklies, Randall Duran, Maina, and Stephen Smith. This week, the weeklies are, they're in Montana, and they are starting a rec league for that Olympic sport that we all became enamored with this summer, not breakdancing, handball. And part of their job is just, educational, teaching people that there is a sport called handball, but the other side of it is just all the difficulty and complications and politics of running a small rec league in any sport. It takes a village. Yeah. Anyway, tomorrow's Thursday, and we will see you then. Thanks for watching and/or listening. Bye.